New in at Manor Park Classics, we've got something really quite special. Now, it sounds weird to say that actually, because we always get special things because we're very lucky here, but this is a Mercedes-Benz 190e 2.516, which means it's the Cosworth engine version, the hot version of the original baby Benz. You see, in the 1960s and 1970s, Mercedes-Benz were very rapidly having their market eaten into by primarily BMW and also to a lesser extent Audi as well, who were just finding their feet. But Mercedes-Benz had gone from a position of absolute market dominance to now suddenly having to fight, and in some ways to up their game and to change their philosophies in order to suit the new 1980s market. And this car, the W201 or the 190, was introduced in 1982-83 as the first compact Mercedes-Benz. And when you think about it, Mercedes' naming scheme makes perfect sense because we have the S-Class or Sonderklasse or Special Class. Then we have the Executive Class, which sits below it, and finally what is now known as the C-Class or Compact Class. Now, of course, this car wasn't called a C-Class in period, but it's the first of the line that would become the C-Class. And so this was an incredibly important car for Mercedes-Benz in this period, and it did them well. Now, I say they had to change their philosophy a little bit, and we'll get into that shortly, but for now, this was designed like a proper Mercedes-Benz. It was styled by Bruno Sacco, who'd been at Mercedes-Benz for coming up to a decade already, and he'd done cars like the W123, he did the W126 S-Class, he did S-Classes all the way up to the kind of jelly mould, the kind of runny egg headlamp style in the late 1990s. So he was at Mercedes-Benz for an awfully long time, and really, he did everything. He dictated how Mercedes-Benz shifted its style throughout this period, from the very classically upright cars like this to that much more acceptable sweeping 90s shape. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself here now. The point is that the 190 wasn't just a new Mercedes-Benz, wasn't just a cut-price version of the contemporary E-Class. Instead, this car launched new ground for Mercedes-Benz. It was the first Mercedes-Benz with a multi-link rear suspension, doing away with the old semi-trailing arms of the older generation of cars. And that meant that this car, well, with these fantastic Mercedes-Benz traditions as well as these new advances, was incredibly well engineered. This was more than a full decade before biodegradable wiring harnesses and the horrendous Daimler-Chrysler deal. This was Daimler-Benz, Mercedes-Benz, doing what they did best. And the easiest way I can find to demonstrate that is to say that in spite of the upright and very classical looking Mercedes-Benz shape, most definitely three-box, you've got the ribbed lamps obviously and all that kind of stuff, and that classic chrome grille with the three-pointed star on the top, as it should always be. Listen to me, Mercedes-Benz UK of today. But with the modifications in the body kit for the Cosworth version, this car has a drag coefficient of 0.32. Now, to put that in perspective, the Ford Sierra and the Audi 100, the Aero-shape Audi 100, launched in the same year as this, and they only had comparable, if not slightly less slippery shapes, in spite of having an aerodynamic influence style overall. This was still most definitely a Mercedes-Benz. This was still very acceptable to the kind of market that Mercedes-Benz had always encapsulated, and yet it was engineered so well that it beat its much more radical looking contemporaries. That's just one example of how Mercedes-Benz just did their engineering differently back in the day. The geometry of the suspension on this car is such that it's just so flat. It's ridiculous to think, but a car that can be both comfortable and very flat and have fantastic road holding and have fantastic handling and be very safe in doing all that, all at the same time. Anyway, I am getting ahead of myself now because we need to go for a drive in a minute, but we will talk about the Cosworth version. Now, Mercedes-Benz in-house had never really done out-and-out hot cars until the 1980s. Of course, AMG existed, but at this point, AMG was not a part of Mercedes-Benz. They were an independent tuning house. And so, on their own, Mercedes-Benz, with the help of Cosworth, of course, in this case, started to just kind of pick into the performance market a little bit, because of course, Mercedes-Benz were competing with BMW. BMW were now on the horizon doing the sporting thing, and so Mercedes-Benz thought, we have to copy them. And now they did it in a very Mercedes-Benz kind of fashion though, because instead of having a big straight six like BMW did, and although you could get a 2.6 litre straight six in a 190, this is only a 4-cylinder engine for better weight distribution. And rather than being a sleek, if impractical, 2-door saloon, this was always a 4-door saloon, like a Mercedes-Benz should be. And while the E30 BMW M3, very much this car's contemporary, was a very expensive kind of hallowed and hewn car with its bodywork modifications to try and improve the frankly horrific drag coefficient of that car, Mercedes-Benz could make this more like a regular production car. Make it tractable, make it that little bit more accessible. Where BMW were going all out on creating a performance car, Mercedes-Benz did the same thing, but it was still a Mercedes-Benz. So, first impressions, and this car feels, shock horror, like a Mercedes-Benz. Who would have thought it? But it doesn't necessarily feel like such a sporting car. You see, this has an automatic transmission, not something you might initially expect from a sporting performance car. And also, it has this really graceful character to the way it accelerates. But that does mean that now I'm sat here in a traffic jam because it's Friday afternoon. It means that I have no use for my left foot thanks to the automatic transmission, and I can just watch out over that bonnet and see that 3-pointed star. As I said, Mercedes-Benz UK, you need to learn this. But what the 190 also has, as do a number of other Mercedes-Benz, is the single wiper. And that's just such a quirky little element of what are otherwise very, very sensible and even, some would say, quite staid cars. What I will say, however, is that the interior is of so much higher quality than an E30 BMW. It feels like a much more grown-up car. The switches, the dials are all of so much higher quality, and these seats are brilliantly bolstered and incredibly comfortable. But of course, Mercedes-Benz got Cosworth to develop one of their existing 4-cylinder engines into this dual overhead cam, 2.3 litre and later 2.5 litre 4-cylinder. And dual overhead camshafts and 16 valves especially were not very common at all in this era. And that means that this car, in spite of losing 2 cylinders, does feel that bit more special. And the other thing is about how supple it is. It just doesn't feel like an out-and-out performance car, and I mean that in a good way, because it feels refined. It's not loud. It doesn't have the raughtiness that an E30 325i has. And yet this car has over 200 brake horsepower. Compare that to just a BMW 325i, which is a lot of money. They only had 170. It is an incredibly different thing, and they've gone about it with such a brilliant level of refinement. But although we're sat again in traffic now, I have had a little chance to see what the handling is like. Now, I can't talk about it when I'm first experiencing it, of course. And it's strange. It's like driving a hydroelastic sprung BMC car. I know that sounds strange, and a lot of you won't even know what I'm talking about when I say that. But what I mean is that it combines ride quality with an exceptional ability to steer. It sounds like a contradiction because we're all tuned in this modern world to the thought process that you need a hard car, a harshly sprung car, a harshly damped car in order to get good handling, but you don't. Ride quality is not a problem, and body roll is not a problem either. You can achieve a brilliant, brilliant compromise if you just engineer it properly. Sure, the 4-cylinder engine doesn't have the raughtiness of a 6, but it still has the power. It is all still there waiting for you. So that if you do want the power output, then this is so much more affordable, probably more reliable, and definitely more restrained than a BMW equivalent.